Introduction to Literature Teaching. Today in this lecture I'm going to give you brief information about how to introduce literature to school. Objectives of today's lecture is to distinguish the salient features of the three models in teaching literature, to compare and contrast the concepts, the study of literature and the use of literature as a resource. Moreover, we are going to differentiate knowledge about literature and knowledge of literature, to explain the competencies and skills learned from literature teaching, as well as to describe the importance of deconstructing the classics. We will also determine the ways of interacting language and literature. So, first of all, let's start from literature in the classroom. There are several reasons for teaching literature in classes today, because as we know that it is demand of society to teach our learners different cultures, different backgrounds of different nations of the world. The reasons for teaching literature necessarily transcend the particular circumstances, places and contexts in which literature is taught, and there are three main reasons for the teaching of literature. And these reasons can include in itself cultural model of literature, language model of literature, personal growth of model of literature, which is suggested by Carter and Long in their book Teaching Literature. So, let's start differentiating different models of teaching literature. The first model is cultural model. From the word itself, you can understand that it is strongly connected with teaching culture as well as literature. Cultural model of teaching literature stresses the value of literature in encapsulating the accumulated wisdom, the best that had been thought and felt within a culture. It also enables students to understand and appreciate cultures and ideologies different from their own in time and space. Cultural model is also associated with a more teacher-centered, transmissive pedagogic mode, which focuses on the text not as a linguistic product, but a product about which students learn to acquire information, not only linguistic sides of the literature, but also cultural aspects of that nation that is described in the literary example. So, second model, as we mentioned, is language model. It is different from cultural model in several ways, because language model is literary medium which stands between cultural model and personal growth model. That literature is made from language, and that the more students can read in and through language, the better they will become to terms with the literary text and literature. Apart from the content, they learn about several terms connected with literature. They supply many linguistic opportunities to the language teacher and allow many of the most valuable exercises of language learning to be based on material capable of stimulating greater interest and involvement that can be the case with many language teaching texts. According to Carter and Long, language model is usually implemented in those directions who are majoring in literature and teaching literature. So, the third model of teaching literature is personal growth model. This is connected with students' personal features, personal characteristics, and it helps students achieve an engagement with the reading of literary texts. The test of teacher success in teaching literature is the extent to which students carry with them beyond the classroom and enjoyment and love for literature. This model of literature is usually conducted for growing interest or engaging students into reading literary piece, and this kind of activities are usually conducted as extracurricular activities in the form of book club, reading clubs. It can also be film club as well. The teacher has to stimulate and enliven students in the literature class by selecting texts to which students can respond and in which they can participate imaginatively. Now let's define the difference between study of literature and literature as a resource. So we have these two terms to define, because as a teacher who is going to teach literature should know that we can use literature as a resource and we can also use literature for the study. So what is study of literature? Study of literature involves reading literature within an academic, institutionalized setting for purposes of obtaining qualifications in literary studies. For instance, those students who are studying in literature department at universities. Students should show an ability to use critical concepts and literary conventions in talking and writing about literature. Study of literature also fosters an understanding of literature as a body of text and a view of literary text as belonging to a background of a specific historical, social, and ideological context. So now let's define what is literature as a resource. Literature as a resource suggests a less academic, though no less serious approach to the reading of literature. When we define literature as a resource, it doesn't mean that it has less importance as study of literature, but in this case, literature as a resource, we use it as a resource during the classes which is directed to learn the language, not the literature itself. And here, literature is considered as a legitimate and valuable resource for language teaching, and this kind of approach is usually used in our other classes apart from literature, like when we teach to improve our students' reading skills, writing skills, speaking and listening skills. Now, what is the difference between knowledge about literature and knowledge of literature? Knowledge about literature is a bit different from knowledge of literature in this way. Knowledge about literature means accumulating facts about literary context, dates, title of text, names of conventions, literary forms, among others, and it easily becomes knowledge for its own sake and does not automatically lead to a more responsive reading or to a ruler interpretation of a text. Now let's talk about knowledge of literature. Knowledge of literature is better expressed in terms of pleasure and enjoyment rather than in terms of accumulation of facts. In knowledge about literature, we usually teach our learners facts about literature, facts about the period, facts about the writer, facts about the characters of the novel. But in knowledge of literature, we just read it for pleasure, and knowledge of literature is more likely to be conveyed by activity-based or student-centered approach, which aim to lead to a high level of personal response and involvement. So, we have defined the terms concerning the model of literature. We have defined the terms between knowledge of literature and knowledge about literature. Now let's move on to how literature should be taught in class. So, first one is competencies and skills that students should learn. When literature is taught as a craft rather than as a body of isolated information, we want students to learn the following competencies and skills. First of all, how to recognize subtle and complex differences in language use, how to read figurative language and distinguish between literal and metaphorical meaning, and how to seek out further knowledge about the literary work, its author, its contents, or its interpretation. These type of competencies and skills are usually developed for those students who are majoring in as a literary specialists or literature teachers. Now let's talk about another aspect of how literature should be taught. Students should also learn how to detect cultural assumption underlying writings from different time or society, and in the process to become aware of one's own cultural assumptions. They should also learn how to relate apparently disparate works to one another and to synthesize ideas that connect them into a tradition or into a literary period. Competencies and skills that students should develop during the literature classes is also to use different literary models, as we mentioned, cultural model, language model, and personal growth model as a cultural references, either to communicate with others or to clarify one's own ideas. One more aspect of competences and skills that students should learn is to think creatively about problems by using literature as a broadening of one's own experience and practical knowledge. It should also be taught to learners to read closely with attention to detailed use of diction, syntax, metaphor and style, not only in high literary works but in decoding the stream of language everyone in modern society is exposed to. It should also be taught that how to create literary text of one's own. We should also teach our learners to compose poems, to create short stories, to write some descriptive essays, whether it is imaginative or critical. So this is also included, it should be included into the competencies, and the skills should be taught during the classes where we implement literary text. And the last thing we should mention is we should develop in our students to think creatively within the literary study and beyond it, making some connection between the literary work and one's own life. So in this case, we need to implement personalization approach where students read a short text and should have to connect some episodes with their own personal life and how to work and learn with others. Taking literature as a focus for discussion analysis, and we can create different discussional or roundtable discussions for learners in order to activate their knowledge taken during the while process of teaching literature. And we should also teach them how to defend a critical judgment against the informed opinions of others. Now, let's talk about interfacing language and literature. There is a big question: is language connected with literature? Can we teach language implementing literature? The real issue for teachers is not whether language and literature should be separate or together. Rather, it is how they can make students become aware of the way in which language patterns of a literary text can help them understand the meaning or the meanings embedded in the text by the author. According to Dela Cruz, literary texts are used as material for helping students acquire reading competencies and for exposing them to the creative uses of language. Emphasis of literature teaching is the use of literature as a tool for learning other skills as well. So through teaching literature, we can improve their reading skills, their writing skills, communicational competencies, speaking skills, as well as listening. Therefore, the classroom becomes an arena for allowing students to generate and express ideas, appreciate the writer's craft, and respond to the themes relevant to their personal growth. So, here is given two types of interfacing language in literature. Literature can be interpreted as interpretation of text, where students should do some critical analysis of themes, values, and culture. And the second interface of language and literature is language practice, language awareness and appreciation, where students work with linguistic elements of the text, syntactical devices, or some stylistic approach used by the author. But this is usually implemented in the higher educational establishment as universities. But the first one usually carried out during the school years of the students, where you can use some short text from literary books and analyze it with students, discussing the themes, values, and culture. Teachers need to make a shift in their view of teaching literature from a largely humanistic model to one that encourages an eclectic approach that sees literature as a resource for both language development and literary appreciation. So, if we conclude our today's lecture, today we generally learned about what is literature teaching itself. We learned about different models of teaching literature. We talked about literature as a resource and literature, knowledge of literature, knowledge about literature, and we discussed some methods of how to teach literature in the connection of language and literature. In our next lectures, we will talk precisely about how to teach poetry, short stories, novels in our classes, and discuss how to use different activities to implement literature in our classes.